There is a Jewish community that never packed a bag, never crossed a border in flight, never boarded a ship bound for somewhere safer, because for roughly 2,500 years, they were already home. When most people picture Jewish history, the image that comes to mind is wandering. Poland, Spain, the Rhineland. A people perpetually displaced, perpetually rebuilding somewhere new. That image isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. Because while one branch of Jewish history was crossing the Alps and settling the river towns of Central Europe, another branch was doing something almost nobody talks about, staying exactly where it started. Baghdad, Isfahan, Sana'a, Aleppo. These aren't stops on a diaspora map. They're the anchors of communities that trace an unbroken residential line back past the Babylonian exile of 586 BCE, back before the word diaspora even applied to them, because they never actually left the region the word describes. This isn't a story stitched together from folklore and communal pride, though the folklore and the pride are real. It's a story that shows up in the genome, in the actual molecular record carried inside living people today. And what's strange is how precisely those two records line up. The DNA doesn't just loosely support the oral history, it draws boundary lines that fall almost exactly where the old community maps already drew them. The backbone of that claim comes from one of the most ambitious genetic surveys of Jewish populations ever conducted, a 2010 study published in Nature, led by geneticist Doron Behar, comparing Jewish communities from across the world against dozens of non-Jewish reference populations. What it found reshapes how this entire history should be told, though the details are worth saving for a moment. For now, sit with the question the whole rest of this comes down to: what happens when a population's DNA and its own oral history agree down to the region? We start with the myth almost everyone already believes, the wandering story, before we take it apart, piece by piece, community by community, until what's left is something far older, far more specific, and far stranger than the version most people were taught. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who actually wants the receipts behind history instead of the shortened version, stick around, because this channel exists for exactly that, and hitting subscribe just means you won't miss where this goes next. The story most people carry around in their heads treats Ashkenazi history as the default Jewish story. European ghettos, shtetls, Yiddish spoken in the streets of Warsaw and Vilnius. It's a rich history, and it's the one that dominates films, novels, and textbooks. But it's one branch among several, not the whole tree. Mizrahi Jews, communities rooted in Iraq, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Kurdistan, and Central Asia, rarely make it into the mainstream retelling at all, despite the fact that they outnumber Ashkenazi Jews in Israel today. The term itself is instructive. Mizrahi simply means Eastern in Hebrew. It isn't a shared migration story, a shared language, or a shared founding myth. It's a geographic category, describing communities that stayed in the region the word itself points to. The historical record backs this up in specific, datable terms. The Iraqi Jewish community's roots trace to the Babylonian exile of 586 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar II's forces destroyed the First Temple and deported a portion of Jerusalem's population to Mesopotamia. That's not a rough estimate. It predates the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, the event most people associate with the start of Jewish exile, by nearly 6 centuries. Persian Jewish history runs on a similarly long clock. The community's presence stretches back to the Achaemenid Empire and the reign of Cyrus the Great, and from there forward, it stayed continuously inhabited for roughly 2,700 years, all the way until 1979. 2 civilizations, 2 empires worth of political upheaval, and in both cases, a Jewish community that simply never left. What makes this more than historical trivia is that the claim in this episode's title isn't poetic license or communal sentiment. It's a testable genetic hypothesis, a claim about ancestry and continuity that can be checked against actual DNA, not just against old texts and oral tradition. And that's exactly what the rest of this tour is built to check. Community by community, study by study. The study built specifically to test that hypothesis at scale didn't come from folklore scholars or historians. It came from a genetics lab, and the numbers it produced are where the real evidence starts. The study in question was published in 2010 in Nature, led by geneticist Doron Behar and a large international team. Its scope was unusually broad for its time, a genome-wide comparison of 14 distinct Jewish communities from around the world, measured against 69 non-Jewish reference populations spanning Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This wasn't a study built to confirm a predetermined conclusion. It was built to map genetic structure wherever the data actually pointed, and where it pointed was specific. Using principal component analysis, a statistical method that plots populations based on genetic similarity, the researchers found that most Jewish samples in the study formed a tight, distinctive subcluster. Not a loose scattering, a cluster with real, measurable boundaries. What sat directly beneath that cluster on the plot mattered even more than the cluster's tightness. It wasn't the populations of the countries these communities had lived in for centuries. It wasn't France, or Poland, or Iraq's broader non-Jewish population, considered generally. It was Druze and Cypriot samples specifically. Populations with their own long, complicated regional histories, but populations rooted in the same Eastern Mediterranean and Levantine geography. The paper's own language put it plainly. The results, in the author's words, trace the origins of most Jewish diaspora communities to the Levant. That's a striking claim on its own. It becomes more striking once you separate out which communities actually drove that pattern. This clustering held specifically for Mizrahi communities. The Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian, Yemenite, and Kurdish populations this tour is about to walk through one at a time, whose ancestors, unlike Ashkenazi Jews, largely never left the wider Middle East region to begin with. There's a counterpoint worth flagging now, one this tour will come back to later. Ethiopian Beta Israel and Indian Bene Israel and Cochin Jewish communities did not fall into this Levant-linked cluster. Their genetic profiles matched their local non-Jewish neighbors instead. Ethiopian populations for one, Indian populations for the other. That contrast will matter enormously later. For now, the question is simpler. Why did the Middle Eastern branch hold its genetic shape for so long, while these other communities didn't? The answer starts with the oldest of these communities, the one whose story begins with an army marching into Jerusalem and a forced march east into Babylon. The year is 586 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II's Babylonian forces breach Jerusalem, raze the first temple, and deport a significant portion of the Judean population east, into the heart of Mesopotamia. For most ancient populations, an event like this marked the beginning of the end, forced displacement that scattered a people until their distinct identity simply dissolved into whatever empire absorbed them next. That is not what happened here. Instead, the exiled community in Babylon became something else entirely. The seedbed of an entire body of religious and legal scholarship, compiled over centuries in Mesopotamia and eventually codified as the Babylonian Talmud, a text that still shapes Jewish religious life today. This wasn't a community passing through. It was a community putting down roots that would hold for 2.5 millennia. By the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, centuries later, Baghdad's Jewish community had grown into one of the largest and most thoroughly documented Jewish populations anywhere in the world. And the continuity didn't stop there. This same community persisted through Sassanid Persian rule, through the Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia, and straight through centuries of Ottoman administration, roughly 2,500 years of residence in the same region, without a single mass departure event breaking the chain. Contrast that against the Ashkenazi story, built on repeated westward migration across multiple centuries and multiple countries, and the difference in kind becomes obvious before any DNA test ever enters the picture. The end, when it finally came, arrived with startling speed. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah airlifted approximately 130,000 Iraqi Jews to Israel in 1951. A single year effectively closing out a continuous Mesopotamian Jewish presence that had opened in 586 BCE. 2,500 years collapsed into one operation, all of which raises the obvious genetic question. Does a 2,500-year unbroken residency in one region actually leave a different signature in the DNA than an Ashkenazi lineage shaped by repeated westward migration across an entirely different continent? Nebel's Y-chromosome research gives a direct answer to exactly that question, and the answer points somewhere researchers didn't fully expect. The answer comes from a study published in 2000 by Almut Nebel and colleagues, built specifically to test whether Jewish and non-Jewish Middle Eastern populations shared a common paternal origin. What the researchers found was striking in its scale. 70% of Jewish men sampled, and 82% of Palestinian Muslim Arab men sampled, carried Y chromosomes belonging to the exact same ancestral pool. That's not a marginal overlap. That's the majority of both populations tracing back through the paternal line to shared ancestry. The finding didn't stand alone. Independently, in the same year, Michael Hammer and colleagues reached a matching conclusion in a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, using binary Y chromosome polymorphisms sampled across the same region. Two separate research teams, two separate methodologies, converging on the same answer. And the overlap wasn't just statistical noise from a broadly similar region. Around a third of the shared Palestinian haplotypes formed a tight, closely related genetic cluster that showed up only rarely among the Jewish samples, meaning the connection ran deeper than simple regional proximity. This wasn't two populations that happened to live near each other picking up similar DNA through centuries of casual contact. It was evidence of shared descent running through a specific, identifiable branch of the paternal line. For a community shaped by the Babylonian exile specifically, the implication is direct. Their paternal ancestry sits firmly inside the broader Levantine and Mesopotamian genetic pool, not off in some separate, isolated genetic island untouched by the populations around it. This finding complicates the simple us and them framing that so often gets layered onto Jewish and Arab population history, because the data itself doesn't support a clean separation. It supports something closer to a shared root system, branching in different directions over thousands of years but never fully severed. Move east from Mesopotamia, up onto the Persian plateau, and this same pattern of continuity doesn't fade. It stretches even longer. Persian Jewish presence in the region reaches back to the Achaemenid Empire, anchored to one of the most consequential decrees in ancient history. Around 538 BCE, Cyrus the Great issued the order permitting exiled Judeans to return to Jerusalem, an event still woven directly into Persian Jewish communal identity today. The Book of Esther, set in the Persian capital of Susa, ties that same communal memory to this exact era, giving the community a literary anchor as old as its historical one. From there, the continuity holds across empire after empire. Isfahan and Shiraz maintained continuous Jewish populations through the Sassanid period, through the Islamic conquest, and through the Safavid era that followed. Three entirely different political and religious regimes, one uninterrupted community living through all of them. Added up, and Persian Jews survived roughly 2,700 years of continuous residence in the same region, making this one of the oldest diaspora populations found anywhere on the planet. The break, when it finally came, arrived far more recently than most people assume. The 1979 Islamic Revolution triggered the community's first true mass departure in nearly 3 millennia, a rupture point after 27 centuries of staying put. Even so, a Jewish population remains in Iran today, and it stands as the largest Jewish population anywhere in the Middle East outside Israel itself. The genetic record backs this historical continuity in exactly the way the Babylonian case did. Genome-wide studies place Iranian Jewish samples squarely within the broader Mizrahi and Middle Eastern genetic cluster, sitting alongside Iraqi and Syrian samples, distinct from the European-inflected genetic profile that shows up in Ashkenazi populations. Same regional signature, different empire, different century, same underlying genetic story. North of Persia and Mesopotamia both, tucked into the mountains, a smaller community tells almost the identical genetic story, with one added twist involving the very language its people still spoke into the 20th century. Kurdish Jewish communities settled into the mountainous terrain of northern Iraq and neighboring Iran, and they carried something remarkable into the modern era. They spoke Aramaic dialects well into the 20th century, a linguistic fossil connecting them directly to the region's ancient tongue, the language spoken across Mesopotamia and the Levant thousands of years earlier. In 2001, Al-Mutnabel and colleagues built a study around exactly this population, sampling 99 Kurdish Jews, each unrelated to the others at the paternal great-grandfather level, most tracing their ancestry back to northern Iraq specifically. The result reshaped how researchers understood the relationship between geographically separated Jewish communities. Kurdish and Sephardic Jews turned out to be genetically indistinguishable from one another on the Y-chromosome, despite centuries of complete geographic separation between the two groups. Both communities did differ slightly, though significantly, from Ashkenazi Jews, a divergence the study attributed to low-level gene flow from European populations and genetic drift accumulated during Ashkenazi Jews' many centuries in Europe. This wasn't a study working from a handful of convenient samples. The researchers drew on 526 total Y chromosomes collected across 6 distinct Middle Eastern populations, giving the Kurdish-Sephardic comparison real statistical weight rather than a thin, anecdotal match. Popular tradition has sometimes linked Kurdish Jews to the lost tribes exiled by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE, a folk narrative passed down for generations. The genetic data doesn't confirm that specific story, but it doesn't need to. The regional continuity stands on its own, independent of any particular ancient tribal legend attached to it. What's more revealing is what happened when researchers turned their attention to a genetic marker originally thought to trace something far more exclusive, the hereditary Jewish priesthood itself. That marker turns out to reach much further than anyone studying it originally expected, straight into a Muslim population living right next door to the Kurdish Jewish communities this segment just described. The marker in question is the Cohen modal haplotype, long associated with the hereditary Jewish priesthood, the Kohanim, and since refined by researchers to the specific designation JZ18271. Branches of this haplotype show up across an unusually wide range of Jewish communities: Yemenite, Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian, Ashkenazi, Algerian, and Moroccan Jews, along with Greek Romaniot and Sephardic communities as well. For years, that breadth alone suggested something significant about a shared, exclusive priestly lineage stretching across the entire Jewish world. Then the picture got more complicated. A 1999 study examining Iraqi Kurds found the same marker present at meaningful frequency among this non-Jewish Muslim population. Not a rare, incidental trace, but a real, measurable presence. Nebel's 2001 research added a further layer of detail. The Muslim Kurdish modal haplotype and the Cohen modal haplotype sat only one microsatellite mutation step apart from each other, though the two occurred on different haplogroup backgrounds entirely. In a 1998 interview, researcher Karl Skarecki, one of the scientists central to the original Cohen modal haplotype research, acknowledged directly that the marker isn't unique to Jews or to Jewish descendants at all. Put plainly, what once looked like an exclusive genetic signature tracing a specific priestly bloodline turns out to be something broader, a regional Middle Eastern lineage, shared well beyond the boundaries of any single religious community. That doesn't diminish the priestly tradition itself, but it does reframe what the DNA can and can't prove about it. West of the Kurdish mountains, in the old cities of Aleppo and Damascus, a different community spent centuries guarding something just as old as any genetic marker, though this time it wasn't a bloodline they were protecting. It was a book. Aleppo's Jewish community dates back at least to Roman antiquity, with continuous documentation carrying it through Byzantine rule, through the Islamic conquest, and straight through centuries of Ottoman administration. For roughly 600 years, this community held custody of the Aleppo Codex, a medieval Hebrew Bible manuscript considered one of the most authoritative texts of its kind, before the manuscript's partial loss and eventual relocation to Israel in the 20th century. Damascus, meanwhile, maintained a parallel Jewish community of its own, just as continuously documented, running through the very same many centuries of shifting empires and administrations. Both communities largely emigrated in waves across the mid to late 20th century, driven out by regional political upheaval that reshaped the entire Middle East within a few short decades. The genetic record for this community matches the pattern already established by its Mesopotamian and Persian counterparts. Genome-wide studies group Syrian Jewish samples within the same Mizrahi cluster as Iraqi and Iranian samples, distinct in the data from the Ashkenazi and Sephardi clusters shaped by centuries in Europe and the Mediterranean. What makes the Syrian case distinct within this broader tour is the cultural dimension running alongside the genetic one. This is a community where institutional continuity, a specific manuscript, passed down and protected across 6 centuries, and a specific communal structure maintained across the same span, runs in parallel with genetic continuity, each reinforcing the other without either one depending on it. South from Aleppo and Damascus, across the length of the Arabian Peninsula, sits a community whose isolation went further still, far enough that it didn't just show up in historical records or communal memory. It left a mark inside a single gene. Yemenite Jewish tradition carries some of the oldest continuity claims found anywhere in the diaspora, with some community narratives placing the community's arrival on the Arabian Peninsula even before the destruction of the First Temple. Whether or not every detail of that tradition can be independently verified, the geographic reality behind it is well documented. Settled at the southern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, this community experienced centuries of minimal contact with other Jewish populations, including the Iraqi and Persian communities sitting just across the Gulf. Distance did what distance tends to do. Over generations, the community developed its own distinct liturgical traditions and its own distinct pronunciation of Hebrew, preserved in a form found almost nowhere else in the Jewish world. That isolation held until the middle of the 20th century, when it ended almost overnight. Operation Magic Carpet, running from 1949 into 1950, airlifted roughly 49,000 Yemenite Jews to Israel over about 18 months. A near-total, rapid transplantation of an entire community after millennia of static residence in one place. The scale of that operation, set against the length of the isolation that preceded it, is part of what makes this community so significant to researchers. The combination of extreme regional isolation and intense endogamy made Yemenite Jews one of the most genetically distinct Jewish subpopulations available to study. And this wasn't isolation that lived only in oral tradition or communal memory, passed down as a story people told about themselves. It left something far more concrete. It left a measurable biological fingerprint written directly into the genome of the community itself. That fingerprint shows up in a mutation researchers didn't expect to find concentrated so heavily in a single population. Researchers studying Yemenite Jewish families affected by autosomal recessive retinitis pigmentosa turned to whole exome sequencing to track down the cause. And what they found was a novel frameshift mutation in the USH1C gene, identified specifically as C22-del-G. The path to that discovery started with homozygosity mapping across two affected families, which revealed a shared genomic region between them. Sequencing that region confirmed the two families carried the identical deletion, not just a similar one. From there, researchers expanded their screening to additional patients and found 16 homozygous carriers of the mutation within the Yemenite Jewish retinitis pigmentosa cohort they examined. Among unaffected individuals tested as controls, the carrier frequency measured at 0.008, meaning roughly 1 in 125 unaffected Yemenite Jewish individuals sampled carried a single copy of the mutation without showing symptoms themselves. What makes this finding remarkable isn't just that the mutation exists, it's how much of the disease burden it accounted for on its own. This single variant was responsible for 23% of all retinitis pigmentosa cases identified in the Yemenite Jewish patients examined, an extraordinary concentration for one mutation to carry inside one community's disease profile. The mutation's effects carried their own distinct signature as well. Unlike typical USH1C mutations, which usually cause congenital hearing loss present from birth, this variant produced late-onset hearing loss instead. Patients under 40 tested with entirely normal hearing, while older patients in the same cohort showed progressive hearing loss developing over time. That's not a coincidence born from random chance. That's the fingerprint of generations of a community, marrying within itself, concentrated down into a single gene, in a single population, on one edge of the Arabian Peninsula. Isolation this deep didn't only happen in Yemen. A nearly identical pattern of genetic isolation turns up again thousands of miles to the east, deep in Central Asia. Bukharian Jewish communities settled across what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, maintaining continuous residence in Central Asia for over 1,000 years along the old Silk Road trade routes that once connected the region to the rest of the ancient world. For a community with that kind of historical depth, the genetic research record is surprisingly thin. Until recently, most large-scale Jewish genetic studies neglected Bukharian samples almost entirely, leaving this branch of Jewish history significantly underdocumented compared to communities like the Iraqi or Yemenite populations already covered. That gap has started closing, not through a major academic institution, but through a community-driven effort. Family Tree DNA's Mizrahi Jewish DNA project, administered by Caucasian mountain Jews Emanuel Izilov and Sergei Davidov, began collecting public Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA results directly from Bukharian participants, building a genetic record where formal academic research had largely left a blank space. What that project uncovered connects directly back to a marker already introduced earlier in this tour. A Bukharian Jewish lineage links directly to JZ18271, the same expanded Cohen modal haplogroup branch found among Yemenite, Iraqi, and Syrian Jews, thousands of miles away from Central Asia. There's a demographic pattern here too, one documented well beyond this single community. Mark Thomas and Michael Wheel's 2002 study, known for its finding on the founding mothers of Jewish communities, demonstrated that geographically separated Jewish popular, a study titled Abraham's Children in the Genome Era, took the comparison across all three major diaspora branches and put it under one microscope. Researchers specifically sampled Iranian, Iraqi, and Syrian Mizrahim, alongside Eastern European Ashkenazim, and alongside Italian, Greek, and Turkish Sephardim. Using principal component analysis, the study placed all three diaspora groups within one larger Jewish cluster overall. But inside that larger cluster, each branch formed its own distinguishable subcluster, genetically separable from the other two. A second statistical method, FOST analysis, which measures genetic distance between populations, added another layer of detail. It showed all the Jewish populations sitting close to one another, and close to non-Jewish Middle Eastern reference populations, and also close to non-Jewish Southern European groups like French, Northern Italian, and Sardinian samples. Within that wider picture, the Mizrahi subcluster specifically sat nearest to the non-Jewish Middle Eastern reference populations of anyone in the study, a result entirely consistent with a group whose regional residence was never actually interrupted. A separate analysis by Campbell and colleagues pushed the resolution even further, splitting out a distinct North African Jewish cluster made up of Tunisian and Libyan samples, refining earlier findings about just how genetically distinctive those two specific communities really are. Layered together, this is where the evidence stops being anecdotal. Behar's 2010 whole cluster study and these separate FST and PCA figures cross-confirm each other using different statistical methods, run on largely different sample sets by different research teams. That's not one study's conclusion holding up under scrutiny. That's independent lines of evidence converging on the same regional map. The Ashkenazi branch, though, the one most retellings of Jewish history treat as the default diaspora story, actually complicates this picture in a way most of those retellings skip entirely. Ashkenazi Jews absorbed real, measurable European ancestry across roughly 1,000 years of settlement in Central and Eastern Europe. Estimates place the maternal line European contribution somewhere between 40% and 60%, a substantial genetic footprint left by a millennium of local conversion and intermarriage across the continent. Given that scale of admixture, the expectation going in might reasonably be that Ashkenazi genetic data would show a population pulled decisively toward its European neighbors. That is not what Behar's 2010 genome-wide PCA found. Ashkenazi samples still landed inside the same tight cluster overlying Druze and Cypriot populations, not pulled toward German, Polish, or Russian host populations, the way that level of admixture might suggest. The implication is direct. Even the diaspora branch that traveled the furthest and absorbed the most outside ancestry of any Jewish community studied never fully lost its underlying Middle Eastern genetic core. That result reframes the entire premise running through this episode. This was never really a clean story about one population that stayed versus one population that left. It's a story about degree, about how much of the original regional signal survived generations of migration, admixture, and isolation, measured separately across every single branch. Seen this way, the Mizrahi branches simply represent the extreme end of that spectrum. Minimal admixture, maximal continuity, generation after generation. Ashkenazi sits at the opposite end of that same spectrum, and even there, the pattern doesn't fully break. So, the distinction that actually separates these branches isn't the presence or absence of Middle Eastern ancestry, because every branch studied carries it. The distinction is how diluted that ancestry became along the way. To see exactly how deep that regional signal runs, the timeline needs to go back much further than any Jewish community's founding. It needs to go back into the Bronze Age. In 2020, a research team led by Lily Agranat-Tamir published a study in the journal Cell, built entirely around genome-wide data recovered from ancient remains. The sample included 73 individuals drawn from 5 archaeological sites across the Bronze and Iron Age southern Levant, including the site of Megiddo. Combined with 20 previously published ancient genomes, the total dataset reached 93 individuals in all, spanning a window from roughly 2400 BCE down to 900 BCE. These populations, sharing what archaeologists call Canaanite material culture, were modeled as descending from 2 distinct sources: earlier local Neolithic populations already settled in the region, and migrants related to the Chalcolithic Zagros, or the Bronze Age Caucasus, arriving from outside it. Researchers then ran comparative modeling against 14 modern Jewish and Levantine Arab populations, and the result was substantial. Both groups typically derive more than 50% of their ancestry from this same ancient Canaanite Zagros genetic blend. That finding predates Israelite history, as it's commonly periodized altogether, meaning the regional genetic core shared by these communities stretches back well over 1,000 years before the Babylonian exile even took place. And the region wasn't frozen in place even then. The non-local Zagros and Caucasus genetic contribution increased gradually across the Middle and Late Bronze Age, showing that this supposedly stable region was never actually static. It was consistently absorbing outside populations into the same core, generation after generation, long before any of the historical communities covered earlier in this tour existed. 3 specific individuals inside that Bronze Age sample break this pattern in a way that changes how staying put should even be defined. 3 individuals, buried together at the site of Megiddo, carried markedly higher Caucasus-related ancestry than their neighbors buried at the very same site. On its own, that might simply read as three outsiders who ended their lives somewhere far from where they began them. Strontium isotope analysis of their remains complicated that reading considerably because it showed local childhood diets, meaning these three individuals grew up eating foods sourced from the region itself, not somewhere distant. Put those two findings together, and the implication is direct. Their migrant ancestors had arrived in the area only a generation or two before these particular individuals were born. Researchers interpreted these Megiddo outliers as evidence of ongoing migration pulses continuing into the Levant well into the late 2nd millennium BCE, rather than a single founding migration followed by total, unbroken isolation afterward. This detail matters for how this entire episode's framing should be understood. Never left was never meant to suggest that nothing ever moved through the region across thousands of years. It means the core regional population absorbed newcomers into itself rather than being replaced by them or diluted away by them, generation after generation. A separate study reinforces the same conclusion from a different city entirely. Haber and colleagues, in 2017, examined roughly 3,700-year-old genomes recovered from Sidon, in present-day Lebanon, and found that present-day Lebanese individuals share more genetic material with those Bronze Age Sidon samples than they do with most other present-day Levantine populations. That Lebanese finding widens this entire frame past Jewish history altogether, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before circling back to where this tour started. Haber's Sidon study wasn't about Jewish populations at all. Researchers sampled 99 present-day Lebanese individuals and compared their genomes directly against 5 Bronze Age Canaanite genomes recovered from the same city, Sidon, dated to roughly 3,700 years old. The result mirrored the same genetic continuity signal Agranat Tamir's team had already found running through Jewish and Arab populations together. Modern Lebanese individuals share disproportionate ancestry with their own Bronze Age predecessors from the very same city. So the pattern of staying genetically rooted in place isn't unique to Mizrahi Jewish history at all. It's a broader Levantine phenomenon showing up across multiple present-day populations that span different religions and different ethnic identities entirely. Druze populations fit this exact same pattern, and it's worth remembering they sat directly alongside the Jewish genetic cluster in Behar's 2010 PCA analysis covered earlier in this tour. Seen against this wider backdrop, Mizrahi Jewish genetic history stops looking like an isolated curiosity and starts looking like one specific, well-documented strand within a much larger regional story of continuity. It also explains something that might have seemed like a coincidence back when it first came up: why the Jewish genetic cluster and the Druze and Cypriot samples sat so close together on Behar's plot in the first place. The answer is shared regional ancestry, running far deeper than any religious or communal boundary drawn on top of it. Not every community that identifies with this broader history tells the identical genetic story, though. The exceptions are exactly where the claim that these populations never left gets tested at its hardest. And those exceptions are where this tour turns next. Ethiopian Beta Israel and Indian Bene Israel and Cochin Jewish communities both carry deep, long-standing Jewish identity and tradition, some of it stretching back many centuries. And yet when Behar's 2010 study turned its attention to these two communities specifically, neither one clustered with the broader Levant-linked Jewish group this entire tour has been tracing. Instead, both clustered genetically with the non-Jewish populations surrounding them geographically. Ethiopian populations for Beta Israel, Western Indian populations for the Bene Israel and Cochin Jewish communities. That result on its own is worth sitting with, but the Bene Israel case adds an extra layer of nuance. For this community specifically, the study noted a clear paternal link to the Levant, even while the broader genomic signal clustered with local Indian populations instead. A split, in other words, between what the Y-chromosome carried and what the rest of the genome told a very different story about. The contrast this creates is genuinely instructive, not just as a footnote, but as the missing piece the entire episode has been building toward. Communities that migrated far and intermarried locally across many centuries did lose the tight regional genetic signature that Iraqi, Persian, Kurdish, Syrian, and Yemenite Jews all retained across the same span of time. That's the real control group sitting behind this whole premise. It's proof that distance and intermarriage genuinely can erase a Levantine signal, given enough time and enough generations, which is exactly why that signal's persistence among the Mizrahi communities covered throughout this tour is so genetically remarkable, rather than something that should simply be assumed or taken for granted. So the dividing line running through all of these communities was never really Jewish versus not Jewish. It's how much geographic and reproductive continuity a population actually maintained over time, regardless of religious identity layered on top of it. All of this leaves one open question the data itself can't fully answer. Across a dozen communities sampled throughout this tour, Iraqi, Persian, Kurdish, Syrian, Yemenite, Bukharian, and Caucasus Mountain Jews, the genome-wide data, the Y-chromosome studies, and the disease mutation research all converge on the same conclusion. These populations carry a Middle Eastern genetic signature preserved across roughly 2,500 years, with minimal outside admixture diluting it along the way. Even Ashkenazi Jews, the branch that traveled furthest from the region and absorbed the most outside ancestry of any community studied, never fully lost that same underlying core. Ancient DNA recovered from Bronze Age Megiddo and Sidon pushes this continuity signal back even further, a full 1,000 years earlier than Jewish history is conventionally dated, tying these Mizrahi communities into a genetic pattern shared with modern Lebanese populations, with Druze populations, and with other Levantine groups across religious and ethnic lines. And the clearest countercases sharpen the picture rather than complicating it. Ethiopian Beta Israel and Indian Bene Israel and Cochin Jews show exactly what happens when a community does leave the region and intermarries locally across many centuries. The regional genetic signature fades, even as religious identity itself endures unbroken. Put all of it together, and the evidence doesn't just support the claim in this episode's title. It draws a far more specific, far older map than most popular accounts of Jewish history ever bother to mention. One stretching from Babylon to Persia, to the Arabian Peninsula, to the Caucasus, and further back still, into the Bronze Age itself. Which leaves one last question worth carrying forward. If a population's DNA can trace an unbroken residential line back past the Babylonian exile, past 6 centuries of empires rising and falling around them, what does that mean for how diaspora itself should really be defined?